the sticks as if, well, there was no consideration for the human being whatsoever. Then is when I realized that any government, whether it is Tsarist government or American democracy or any liberal regime, those who have power misuse their power against the weaker individual or the masses who are not armed and cannot defend themselves. And I wasn't surprised anymore, no matter what they did. I expected the worst.
Emma Goldman once described Molly Steimer as having an iron will and a tender heart. At age 20, Molly was part of a New York anarchist group that published an underground newspaper. In 1918, she and her comrades were arrested for distributing leaflets protesting American intervention in Russia. One of the young anarchists was beaten to death by the police. Molly and the others were convicted of violating the Espionage Act. At the trial, Molly's spirited self-defense made headlines.
She declared, "Individual freedom shall prevail in the full sense of the word. To the fulfillment of this idea, I shall devote all my energy, and if necessary, render my life for it." She was sentenced to 15 years at the federal penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri, but she was only to serve a fraction of her term.
Finally, in 1923, I was called to the office in Jefferson, Missouri, and told that I am to be deported and that I am to sign these and these papers. I declined. I said, I don't want to be deported. I don't want to be pardoned. You sentenced me. When all political prisoners will be freed, I will be freed. And I went back to my cell. When I was told that the boys are already in Ellis Island and they're only waiting for me and that I should accept, I did not sign the papers in any event, and I said I'm not going to leave because there is a railroad strike. And I'm not going to go on a train that is led by Skeps. So I was kept for 10 days longer until the strike was finished. When the strike was finished, they took me, but I never signed my deportation papers. This I never did. Or call them liberation or deportation or whatever it was, I never signed them. My anticipation was that I'm going to a country where there is a revolution, but that the revolution took the wrong road because they have a government, a police regime, and that the anarchists will have to continue the struggle. But there is a revolution, and I went with a certain enthusiasm because there was an uprising against the oppression. That there will be a struggle, there was no doubt in me.
The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a spontaneous uprising of peasants and workers. All across Russia, workers organized factory committees, called Soviets, and popular assemblies in the villages.
Then the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, swiftly and ruthlessly imposed one-party rule. They claimed that the success of the revolution depended upon the people's obedience to the single rule of the leaders. The Cheka, the secret police, suppressed all non-Bolshevik factions, including the Russian anarchists. The great anarchist theoretician, Peter Kropotkin, returned from exile hoping to see his ideas of mutual aid put into practice. He died in 1921, disillusioned with the course of the revolution. Ironically, many imprisoned anarchists were permitted to attend his funeral, but it was the death knell for anarchism in Russia, and those lucky enough to escape, like Emma Goldman and Molly Steimer, reluctantly turned their backs on the country of their birth.
Years earlier, Michael Bakunin, one of anarchism's leading proponents, warned that the Marxists, instead of abolishing state power, would simply transfer it from one group to another. His words turned out to be prophetic. He said Marx and his friends will concentrate all the powers of government in strong hands. The red bureaucracy will be the most violent, terrible lie our century has created.
My background and how I have become an anarchist is a long, long story. I had entered the communist children's movement an organization called the Young Pioneers of America in 1930 in New York City. I was only 9 years of age and had gone through the entire 30s as a Stalinist initially, and then increasingly as someone who was more and more sympathetic to Trotskyism. And by 1939, after having seen Hitler rise to power, the Austrian Workers' Revolt of 1934, an almost completely forgotten episode in labor history, the Spanish Revolution, by which I mean the so-called Spanish Civil War, I finally became utterly disillusioned with Stalinism and drifted increasingly toward Trotskyism. And by 1945, I finally also became disillusioned with Trotskyism, and I would say now increasingly with Marxism and Leninism. But the essential thing, so far as I'm concerned, as I reflect upon all of this now, is that I had gone through a period of Marxism which is almost unknown today to many American radicals, a period when Marxism was a workers' movement to a very great extent, and when it was a movement in the streets, in which hundreds of thousands of people at times could be brought out in massive demonstrations throughout the country under red flags, whether it be communist or socialist. And by the end of the Second World War, and particularly by the end of the 1940s, I literally saw this movement disappear, and disappear from history, at least as far as the United States is concerned. And I have no belief whatever that it will come back again. Namely, what I'm saying is, I saw the end of the classical workers' movement. And I had to ask myself, why had this come about? What did this mean? And the conclusion I came to is this, that the workers' movement never really had a revolutionary potential. That the factories, and I had worked in factories for 10 years, and had worked in factories partly as a labor organizer in the old CIO before it united with the AFL, when it was still in a very militant, stage of its development. That this workers' movement had never really had the revolutionary potentialities that Marx attributed to it. That in point of fact, the factory, which is supposed to organize the workers in Marx's language, mobilize them and instill in them the class consciousness that is to stem out of a conflict between wage labor and capital, in fact had created habits of mind in the worker that served to regiment the worker, that served in fact to assimilate the worker to the work ethic, to the industrial routine, to hierarchical forms of organization, and that no matter how compellingly Marx had argued that such a movement could have revolutionary consequences, in fact, such a movement could have nothing but a purely adaptive function, an adjunct to the capitalist system itself. And I began to try to explore what were movements and ideologies, if you like, that really were liberatory, that really freed people of this hierarchical sensibility and mentality, of this authoritarian outlook, of this complete assimilation by the work ethic. And I now began to turn very consciously toward anarchist views, because anarchism posed the question not simply of a struggle between classes based upon economic exploitation. Anarchism really was posing a much broader historical question that even goes beyond our industrial civilization. Not just classes, but hierarchy. Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school. Hierarchy as it exists in sexual relationships. Hierarchy as it exists between ethnic groups. Not only class divisions based upon economic exploitation. And it was concerned not only with economic exploitation, it was concerned with domination. Domination which may not even have any economic meaning at all. The domination of women by men in which women are not economically exploited. The domination of ordinary people by bureaucrats, in which you may even have a welfare, so-called socialist type of state. Domination as it exists today in China, even when you're supposed to have a classless society. Domination even as it exists in Russia, where you are supposed to have a classless society. You see, so these are the things that I noted in anarchism, and increasingly I came to the conclusion that if we were to avoid, or if we are to avoid, the mistakes that were made over 100 years of proletarian socialism, if we are to really achieve a liberatory movement, not simply in terms of economic questions, but in terms of every aspect of life, we would have to turn to anarchism, because it alone posed the problem not merely of class domination, but hierarchical domination. And it alone posed the question